You ever have battles on the home front? Now, I don't mean physical, not knockdown, drag-out fights, but more subtle, relational, guerrilla warfare type battles. For example, at our house, sometimes we have the battle of the light switches. You guys ever had that at your place? When it gets to be close to bedtime, I walk by and I shut off every light in the house, and then from the other room, I hear this little voice that says, "I'm not going to bed yet. Or vice versa. Dory wants to do some work in a room, and and she keeps the lights on. It's like this back and forth from time to time. But one of the greatest battles that any relationship can face, maybe the greatest test of any marriage, is not the light switches. It's not the finances. It's not even parenting. It's the thermostat in the house. One person is always freezing and bumping it up. The other person is always burning up and dropping it down. Now, Dory and I, we've had some heated discussions about the thermostat. Get it? Heated discussions? Oh, come on. I've been waiting all week to say that line. We've been going through a series of sermons in the book of Daniel, and we've entitled this series, "In the Fire." And in Daniel chapter 3, where we come to today, the thermostat isn't the only household squabble. The heat is turned up in this chapter. It's turned up 7 times to test faith itself. Now, if you have children, you realize that when children get excited about something, or when children feel something's important, they tend to repeat themselves. If they want to do something, they'll ask over and over and over again. Over Labor Day weekend, we spent time with our granddaughter, and she's at the age now where she loves playing with bubbles. And when she wants to go outside and do bubbles, man, it's like, can we do bubbles? Can we do bubbles? Can we do bubbles? And sooner or later, your willpower breaks down. You get up, you go outside, and you play with bubbles. And it's actually kind of relaxing. But when you see repetition in the Bible, that means something's important. When you see a word repeated over and over again, that's a clue for us to pay attention. And in chapter 3 of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar repeats some phrases that we need to pay attention to. One, he says, "I have set up," or "I have built an image of gold." And he repeats this. This is what I have done. I have built this. But then he ties that image to worship. And the word worship is used 9 times in this chapter alone. And that gives us a clue on what this chapter is about. The chapter opens up, verse 1, saying this: "King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth was 6 cubits. In other words, 90 feet tall by 9 feet across. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon." And then King Nebuchadnezzar, he gives us to command to worship this image. When music is played, when the full orchestra, the full band breaks into music, all the instruments are playing. He says in verse 6, "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a fiery furnace." We all worship something. Our world really demands worship. Our world and our culture calls us to worship things. And not maybe in the ancient Babylonian sense of a golden image, a tower like that. But there is pressure in our lives today to conform to the idols of our age. Whether that's success or just comfort or power or money or sex or control, approval, we're all told to bow or be burned, to compromise or be canceled, to give in or to be left out. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's desire in this chapter is both for prominence and power. And we can really see his pride welling up in this chapter. And it really ties back to chapter 2. If you remember that chapter, there's this vision given of different kingdoms, and Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. But it's only a temporary kingdom, a temporary king. But Nebuchadnezzar, in his pride, he wanted it all. And we get a feel for his level of pride in this chapter, because this vision that he has, he doesn't want it to be temporary. He doesn't want it to be short-lived. He wants it to be a long time. And he seeks this prominence through worship. Dr. Shane Wood, a professor at Ozark Christian College, when he's teaching on Daniel 3, he puts it this way, that in this chapter, worship is war. And I love how he just boils that down succinctly, that worship is war. So here in this chapter, we read about 3 young exiles named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they face a worship war. A powerful king demands their worship, and they refuse. And in the middle of this war, God shows up. Now, this story about the fiery furnace, it's not just, inspiring children's story that's for the Sunday school classes only. It really gives us a preview and a glimpse of the entire gospel. It shows us, as believers, how to live with courage in the fire. It shows us that we can have hope, and not just to avoid trials, but hope in the God who delivers us in the midst of them. You see, one of the greatest challenges that we face as believers is learning how to live faithfully in a world that does not share our conviction. How do we live as believers in a world that just does not support our values? So we receive pressure, and sometimes that pressure is subtle or covert. Maybe there's quiet expectations for us to go along with everybody else and everything else. Sometimes the pressure is overt, and there are demands to compromise or suffer the consequences. Well, all throughout Scripture, we see that God calls his people over and over again to remain faithful to him, even when it costs them everything. And here in Daniel chapter 3, it's a call to worship. And it's centered around a question of who is the real God and who will you worship? So as we read, this chapter opens up with this incredible pressure to conform. Nebuchadnezzar, he builds this golden image. It's probably the size of the Washington Monument to help you kind of put it into scope. And he gathers all of the officials, all the government leaders, all of the governors, the officials, everybody that has a position of prominence in the empire. They gather together for a dedication ceremony of this image. And it's a worship gathering that's of national, political, and religious importance. He wants his leaders to be unified. And it's all centered around Nebuchadnezzar as king. So when Nebuchadnezzar has his band play the music, at the sound of music, everyone is commanded to bow down and worship this image of gold, or else be thrown into the fiery furnace. So there's a precise time for worship. There's a precise expectation of submission when the music is played. But this is more than just affirming your loyalty to a leader. This is really a call to idolatry. The king was demanding worship that only belonged to God. And the king was saying, pledge your allegiance to me and me alone. Well, this goes against the very first commandment given to Israel. If you remember the 10 commandments given to Moses to share with people, they were given on Mount Sinai, and Moses shares them with the people. And number 1 on the list in Exodus chapter 20 says this: you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath, and that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the pressure that day would have been enormous. They're in these positions of authority. They're part of the leadership of the government. Everybody's watching them that day. The furnace is there, looming as a threat. They can feel the heat, yet Exodus chapter 20 is in their hearts. And as the music is played, as Nebuchadnezzar's orchestra breaks out in song, the only lyrics that these three men are hearing is, "You shall have no other God before me." So the worship war that they faced was not subtle. It was all about conformity. It was all about compliance. And that meant life, but at the expense of disobedience to God. To resist that expectation would come with a cost. It literally would cost them their lives. Now, the worship wars that we face today go way beyond just your preference of music styles on a Sunday morning worship service. Because our world promises comfort if you worship their ways, promises security and acceptance only if we bow down to the expectations of our culture. So today's idols are not necessarily 90-foot statues, but they are just as real. You know, they seduce us by taking something good, like a job success or sports or money or comfort or relationships. They take things that might be good and turn it into the ultimate thing, the greatest thing. And when a good thing becomes a God thing, it becomes a bad thing. And the idols in our time, they demand loyalty as well. So when the world plays its music and says, when you hear this, bow down like everybody else, follow along, and it says you can go ahead and put your allegiance in anything, but just not in an absolute God and in his absolute word. And when we refuse, well, we might be excluded, we might be mocked, or even penalized or canceled. So Nebuchadnezzar, he sets up this golden image, and he demands worship. So I want to ask you this morning, I guess, what image is set up in your heart? What idol might be there that's calling you to worship? Who and where are you putting your allegiance? And where are you tempted to compromise? Is it with godly values? Is it with biblical authority? Is it with your sobriety or sexual purity or financial gain? See, our faith is tested and will be tested when culture demands what God forbids. Well, that's when we really need courage to stand. Not everybody that day when the music is played bows down and worship. Those three men don't. And the king, he hears about it. So in verse 12 of Daniel 3, some of his other officials, they come to the king, and here's what they say. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, they pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So these other government officials, they come and just tattle on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they say, King, these are your boys that you have set up. But they don't respect who you are. They don't serve your gods. And they're not worshiping this image that you told us all to worship. So the king, he calls them in personally. And he gives them one more chance to bow down and worship. And he says, if you worship, everything will be fine. Refuse, and you can feel the heat of the fiery furnace. So reading on in verse 15, this is the king talking. He says, now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn and pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace? And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Well, Nebuchadnezzar is about to find out. Because here's how the three guys reply. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So these three young men are given a clear opportunity to compromise. And they could have said, well, we'll bow outwardly, but we'll still believe in our hearts. And they could have reasoned that, well, God placed us here in Babylon, and we need to keep our positions of influence. But they did not bend, and they did not bow. And their reply that day, I think, is one of the more powerful confessions of faith in all of Scripture. They believed, one, that God was able to deliver them, and they trusted that God would deliver them, whether in life or death. But even if not, they said they're going to remain faithful. You see, they knew God's power. They knew the God whom they served, but they did not always know his plans or purposes in the event. And you know what? Neither do we. We can know God's power, we can know, his purpose, but we don't always know what's going to transpire. See, Courage in the Fire says this. Courage in the Fire says our obedience is not dependent on the outcome. And our loyalty is to God and not to the results. And Journey, I think we need to hear that. Sometimes we focus on the outcome. Sometimes we just want the result, and our obedience and loyalty is dependent on that. But that's not how Scripture teaches it. God calls us to obey even when we don't know what the results will be. Now, if you know how the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ends, you might miss the point of the whole sermon. Maybe this story is familiar to you from your Sunday school days, and if you're rolling through that in your mind right now, you might miss what really is being taught here. Because deliverance or rescue from the furnace is not the point of the story. The point of the fiery furnace is that we worship God because of who he is, not because of what we get. You see the difference? Instead of looking to God for just the miraculous rescue, God calls us to worship him just because of who he is. And worship is the whole point of the story, even if it costs us incredibly much. See, the courage that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had that day was just a settled conviction that God is in control. And they trusted God's power. They knew he was a powerful God. They submitted to God's will. They stood firm, irregardless of the outcome that day. So the question we need to ask ourselves as we work through a text like this is, will we remain faithful even when it costs us? Will we remain faithful even if it costs us a relationship, a job, a promotion? Well, Journey, I want to say that Jesus is worth it. He's worth it. Now we know from this chapter that Nebuchadnezzar's rage begins to grow, and he orders the furnace heated 7 times greater than normal, and it's a toss-up that day, which is hotter, the king or the furnace. So we read on up in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar, he was filled with fury, and the expression of his face changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the fiery furnace. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, but I see 4. I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Well, the men are removed, and they're not burnt. They're not crispy. They're not even smelling like fire. And then in verse 20, it says that Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded their bodies rather than serve any god except their own God. Well, inside the flames, inside the furnace, something incredible happens. 3 guys go into the fire, and 4 are walking around in the fire. And here's where we see the presence of God. The presence of God shows up. The God who called them to stand has now delivered them in the midst of the fire. And their deliverance leads to a testimony and the spread of God's glory. It doesn't give us the name of this 4th man in the fire. Now, many scholars, as I was reading this week, a lot of scholars throughout history see this as a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, Son of God, walking around in the flames. It's a reflection of God's name, Emmanuel, God with us. But I think we can see kind of a prefigurement of Christ, the one who came to dwell in a chaotic world, who even experienced death. Not so that we would escape the experience of death, but that we might have victory over it. In fact, Jesus promised in Matthew 28, he said, I am with you always to the end of the age. And I think that means also in the fires that we walk through. The difficult lesson of Daniel 3 is that God does not always keep us from the fire. But this is about God's presence with us in the midst of the fires that we experience. And this just illustrates the overarching theme of the entire book, that in spite of present appearances, God is in control. Jesus walks with us in the fire we encounter. Well, boil this down and give you some takeaways from this chapter. One, I think, is just we can expect pressure. Following Christ today is going to bring moments of decision where we're going to force to either choose kindness or conviction. And those fires will flare up, so expect it. And don't be surprised when they come. Second, just focus on obedience to God's word and not the outcomes. Let your faith be the non-negotiable thing in your life. So just honor Christ even when it's unpopular. Thirdly, just trust God's presence. God doesn't always remove us from the fire, but Scripture tells us that Jesus walks with us even in those difficult places. And then another takeaway is simply to live as a witness for God's glory. Our faithfulness under pressure can point other people to the reality of God's glory. So give God the glory. Let your difficult circumstances point other people to Jesus. I'll invite the praise team back up this morning, and I think we really need to remember that Daniel chapter 3 is not just a Sunday school lesson for kids. It's really a story about us. It's the story that points us to Christ, the one who walked through the ultimate fire for us, the one who now walks with us through every difficulty. Richard Wurmbrand was a Romanian during the communist era, and he spent 14 years in a communist prison for refusing to deny Christ and for preaching the gospel. And he wrote about his experience in a book called Torture of Christ. And he describes how him and his fellow prisoners were starved and beaten and locked away in dark cells because of their faith. Yet in the flames of those sufferings, in the midst of those difficulties, the prisoners would get together and they would whisper hymns back and forth. They would share scripture from memory and even smile through busted and broken lips. And Wurmbrand wrote in his book that it was strictly forbidden to preach to one another. But a number of us decided that they were willing to pay the price for preaching the gospel to other prisoners. So they accepted the terms, and it was understood that whoever was caught preaching would receive a beating. So they decided that we were happy preaching, and the guards were happy beating us. So everybody was happy. But, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Richard Wurmbrand knew that God would deliver them. But even if not, he knew that Jesus was worth it. And just as in Daniel 3, the true miracle wasn't simply that some survived this persecution. It was about Christ's presence with them, even in those jail cells. This deliverance from the fiery furnace, it's spectacular. It makes a great children's lesson. But the story is not about the miracle. It's about the God who is able to rescue. It's about who we worship. So, Journey, I end with this today. See, worship is war. So who will you worship? So choose today to worship Jesus and him alone. Let's stand together as we sing.